The general's stars caught the morning light through her Arlington office window, but Elizabeth Kane barely noticed. 4 silver stars, earned through 3 decades of sacrifice, now felt like weights pinning her to a desk while her marriage dissolved via lawyers' emails, and her daughter sent texts meant for someone else. The Pentagon's corridors whispered her name with respect, but respect couldn't fill the silence in her Bethesda townhouse or explain why excellence had cost her everything that mattered. She'd commanded carrier strike groups, negotiated with foreign ministers, and rebuilt entire command structures. Yet she couldn't remember the last time someone looked at her and saw anything beyond the uniform. The knock came at 5:47, unusual because her aide never arrived before 6. Elizabeth glanced up from casualty reports to find not her aide but a maintenance worker, dark-skinned with graying temples and hands that suggested years of physical labor. He carried a toolbox and wore the typically uncomfortable expression of someone entering a space far above their pay grade. His name tape read Morrison. She waved him toward the problematic heating vent without breaking from her reading, already forgetting him before he'd crossed the threshold. Just another invisible person keeping the machine running while important people made important decisions. Morrison worked quietly, efficiently, the soft clank of tools barely registering against her focus. She was deep into tactical assessments from the 7th Fleet when his voice cut through, not loud but somehow impossible to ignore. "Ma'am, with respect, you're reading those reports like someone checking boxes instead of seeing people." Elizabeth's head snapped up, shock momentarily overriding the instinct to dress down this presumption. Morrison didn't flinch. He was crouched by the vent, not even looking at her, continuing in that same measured tone. 23 years Marine Corps, gunnery sergeant, I know that look. You're running on obligation, not purpose. The audacity should have ended in his immediate removal. Instead, Elizabeth found herself frozen because beneath her anger was the terrible recognition of truth. Morrison finally met her eyes, and she saw something there that the Joint Chiefs never showed her: genuine concern unattached to rank or advancement. "My daughter stopped talking to me too," he said quietly. "After her mother passed, I thought providing and serving was enough. Learned different." He returned to his work as if he hadn't just detonated something in her carefully controlled world. Sometimes the hardest mission is admitting what we're actually fighting for. Morrison finished and left, the entire interaction maybe 90 seconds. Elizabeth sat motionless, staring at reports that suddenly seemed like elaborate emotional shields. 1 minute, one honest stranger, and something long calcified in her chest began, impossibly, to crack. The rest of that day passed in a fog. Elizabeth moved through meetings with the Secretary of Defense, a video call with Pacific Command, and a budget session that would determine operational funding for 60,000 personnel. She performed flawlessly because performance was her native language, but Morrison's words echoed beneath every interaction. "You're reading those reports like someone checking boxes instead of seeing people." She'd built her career on caring about every soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine under her command. She'd fought for their equipment, their training, their families. But when had she stopped seeing them as anything more than data points in an endless operational calculus? That evening, Elizabeth did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She left the Pentagon at a reasonable hour. Her townhouse in Bethesda greeted her with its usual hollow silence, expensive furniture arranged with decorator precision in rooms she barely inhabited. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the phone in her hand, her daughter's last text still unanswered from 4 days ago. Just logistical information about changing her emergency contact. Not even a question that required response. The message was clear: you're an obligation, not a mother. Elizabeth's finger hovered over the call button. 3 decades of commanding men and women in life-or-death situations, and she couldn't find the courage to call her own child. The irony wasn't lost on her. She set the phone down, poured a glass of wine she wouldn't finish, and walked to her home office. The walls were decorated with the expected military memorabilia: plaques, photos with presidents and foreign dignitaries, her officer candidate's school class portrait where she'd been one of 3 women. Evidence of a life spent proving she belonged. A framed photo caught her eye, half hidden behind her desktop monitor. Elizabeth and her daughter, maybe 8 years ago, both in hiking gear at the summit of Old Rag Mountain. They'd made that climb on Elizabeth's rare leave, talking for hours about everything and nothing. Her daughter's smile in that photo was genuine, proud, unguarded. Elizabeth tried to remember the last time she'd seen that expression in person and came up empty. Somewhere between that mountain and this office, she'd lost the map. The next morning, Elizabeth arrived at the Pentagon at 5:30, earlier than usual, running from thoughts that followed her through sleepless hours. Morrison was in the corridor pushing a maintenance cart and something made her stop. He straightened respectfully, clearly surprised. "The vent's working fine, ma'am." Elizabeth hesitated, 4 stars heavy on her shoulders, then spoke before courage failed. "Your daughter, did you fix it?" Morrison's expression softened with something that looked like hard-won wisdom. "Fixed is a strong word. We're talking." Took me admitting I'd been treating her like a subordinate instead of a daughter. Turns out respect and love aren't the same thing. The simplicity of it landed like ordnance. Elizabeth had spent decades mastering the former while letting the latter atrophy. "How did you start?" she asked, and heard the vulnerability in her own voice. Morrison smiled slightly. "I stopped trying to have the perfect conversation and just told her the truth, that I missed her, that I'd screwed up, that I wanted to learn how to be her father instead of just someone who provided for her." He paused, then added gently, "Permission to speak freely, General." She nodded. "Your daughter doesn't need a 4-star officer. She needs her mom." Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic plate of long-defended emotional territory beginning to move. She thanked Morrison and continued to her office, but the day unfolded differently. In meetings, she found herself listening past the briefings to the people giving them. A colonel's fatigue that suggested family trouble. A major's hesitation that spoke of doubt she was too junior to voice. A petty officer's pride poorly concealing anxiety about an upcoming deployment. They'd always been there, these human elements beneath the professional veneer. Elizabeth had just trained herself not to see them. At 1300, between a Joint Chiefs session and a call with European Command, Elizabeth closed her office door and dialed before she could reconsider. Her daughter answered on the 4th ring, voice carefully neutral. "Mom." Not hello, not even cold, just factual. Elizabeth gripped the phone, 3 decades of command presence useless against this moment. "Sweetheart, I know I don't have the right to ask for your time, but I need to talk to you. Not about logistics or schedules. Really talk." Silence stretched, then carefully, "Okay." They met at a coffee shop in Arlington, neutral ground far from the Pentagon's gravitational pull. Her daughter arrived late, a small power play Elizabeth recognized and accepted as deserved. 26 years old, working in international development, wearing casual clothes that somehow made Elizabeth's civilian outfit feel like a costume. They ordered coffee and sat at a corner table, awkwardness thick as smoke. Elizabeth had commanded rooms full of hostile foreign officials, with more confidence than she felt facing her own child. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth began, and watched her daughter's eyebrows rise slightly. "Not for being military, I'm proud of my service, but for letting the uniform become everything, for treating you like something to be managed instead of someone to know, for missing so much of your life that when I look at you now, I realize I don't really know who you've become." Her voice cracked on the last words, and she didn't try to hide it. Armor off. Stars left at the door. Her daughter's eyes shimmered. "Do you even remember my college graduation?" The question was quiet, devastating. Elizabeth started to answer, then stopped. She remembered being there, remembered the ceremony, but the details were fog. Her daughter continued, "You flew in that morning and left that afternoon. You took pictures but spent half the ceremony checking your phone. I remember thinking that even on my day, you weren't actually there." "You're right," Elizabeth said, and the admission hurt more than any combat report she'd ever read. "I was physically present and emotionally absent. I told myself I was serving something bigger, but the truth is I was hiding. Being General Kane was easier than being your mom because I knew how to succeed at one and was terrified of failing at the other." She reached across the table, not quite touching. "I don't know how to fix 3 decades of getting this wrong, but I want to try. If you're willing to let me." The conversation that followed was halting, painful, and real. Her daughter spoke about feeling like an obligation, about watching her mother choose briefings over birthdays, about the slow realization that the person she needed wasn't coming back. Elizabeth listened without defending, without explaining, just hearing the cost of her choices reflected in her child's voice. They talked past the coffee growing cold, through the afternoon shift change, until the early dinner crowd began filtering in. No magic reconciliation, no tearful embrace, just the first honest conversation they'd had in years. When they parted, her daughter's hug was brief but genuine. "This doesn't fix everything, Mom, but it's a start." Elizabeth drove back to Bethesda with tears streaming down her face, the kind of breakdown she'd trained herself never to have. But beneath the grief was something else: possibility. Morrison had been right. The hardest mission was admitting what she was actually fighting for. And for the first time in decades, Elizabeth thought she might be brave enough to fight for it. The next weeks unfolded with deliberate change. Elizabeth still worked punishing hours because her responsibilities were real and consequential, but she became fiercely protective of boundaries. Dinner with her daughter every Tuesday, non-negotiable except for genuine emergencies. Phone calls that lasted longer than logistics. Questions about her daughter's work, her friends, her life that Elizabeth had let become foreign territory. It was awkward, sometimes stilted, but it was real. At the Pentagon, colleagues noticed something different in General Kane. She still commanded with absolute authority, still made the hard calls that rank demanded, but there was a shift in her presence. She remembered names more readily, asked about families, actually listened to answers instead of waiting for her turn to speak. In a meeting about deployment schedules, she'd surprised everyone by pausing mid-briefing to ask a colonel if he needed more time before his unit shipped out, his new baby evident in his exhaustion. The colonel had been stunned, then grateful. Small things, human things. Morrison she saw occasionally in corridors, their interactions brief but meaningful. He never presumed on their connection, maintained proper military courtesy, but there was understanding in his nods. Once, passing in an empty hallway, he'd said quietly, "Heard you're having dinner with your daughter regularly. That's good, ma'am." Elizabeth had smiled, genuinely. "Still awkward, but we're trying. Thank you, Gunny, for the reminder that rank isn't purpose." 3 months after that first conversation, Elizabeth was invited to speak at the Naval Academy graduation. Standard stuff: duty, honor, service to something larger than self. She'd given versions of the speech dozens of times. But standing at that podium, looking at young faces about to enter the profession she'd dedicated her life to, Elizabeth found herself deviating from her prepared remarks. "You're about to join something bigger than yourselves," she began, "and that's worthy and important. But I want to give you advice I wish someone had given me 30 years ago. Don't let service become hiding. Don't confuse excellence at your job with excellence at being human. The stars and rank will come or they won't, but either way, don't wake up one day and realize you traded the people you love for the job you thought defined you." The audience stirred, surprised. This wasn't typical general officer rhetoric. Elizabeth continued, her voice carrying the weight of lived regret. "A few months ago, a Marine gunnery sergeant working maintenance said something that changed my life. He reminded me I was seeing positions instead of people, including my own daughter. He had the courage to speak truth to power, and I had barely enough humility to hear it. I'm standing here today as a cautionary tale and a work in progress. Serve with everything you have, but don't forget why you're serving or who you're going home to." After the ceremony, several graduates approached her, thanking her for the honesty. One young woman, newly commissioned, spoke with particular intensity. "My mom's career Navy, ma'am, Commander. I've watched her struggle with exactly what you described. Can I share your words with her?" Elizabeth nodded, recognizing herself in the daughter's concern. "Tell her it's never too late, and that being excellent at both takes more courage than being excellent at one." That evening, Elizabeth met her daughter for dinner, their Tuesday tradition now 4 months strong. The awkwardness had eased into something approaching comfortable. They talked about her daughter's work in South Sudan, about Elizabeth's upcoming testimony before Congress, about nothing and everything. Mid-meal, her daughter set down her fork and looked at Elizabeth directly. "I saw your academy speech. Someone posted a clip online." Elizabeth tensed, uncertain. Her daughter smiled, something genuine and almost surprised. "You've really changed, Mom. I didn't think it was possible." "I'm trying," Elizabeth said quietly. "Some days better than others. I can't get back the time I missed, and I know I'll never be the mother you deserved when you were young, but I'm hopping to be the mother you need now." Her daughter reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a gesture so simple it made Elizabeth's throat tight. "You are, Mom. You really are." 6 months after Morrison's maintenance call, Elizabeth received orders that would normally have been automatic acceptance. Command of Central Command, one of the military's most critical positions. Theater Command, influence over strategy spanning multiple countries, a capstone to an already distinguished career. She'd wanted this for years, had positioned herself precisely for this opportunity. The job was in Tampa, required constant travel, would consume every waking hour. She looked at the orders and felt something she'd never experienced before regarding her career: doubt. Elizabeth requested a week to consider, unusual enough that it raised eyebrows at the highest levels. She spent that week in careful reflection, talking with her daughter, even seeking out Morrison one afternoon. She found him working in the Pentagon's lower levels, pulling cable through access panels. He straightened respectfully, surprise evident. "General, sir, is something wrong?" Elizabeth smiled at the Marine's reflexive formality. "Gunny, I need advice from someone who already fought this battle." Central Command. Dream job, perfect capstone to my career. It would also mean moving, constant travel, and basically returning to the life I'm trying to leave behind. My daughter and I are finally building something real. I don't know if I can do both. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, thoughtful. "Can't tell you what's right, ma'am. That's above my pay grade in every way, but I can tell you what I learned. When my daughter needed me most, I was in Helmand Province, convinced I was doing something important. I was doing something important, but I wasn't doing the most important thing. No one in the Corps was going to die if I wasn't there. My relationship with my daughter would die if I wasn't there. I chose wrong. Took me years to understand that." He met her eyes. "Only you know what your most important mission is now, General." Elizabeth thanked him and spent the next 3 days wrestling with a decision that felt impossible. She'd built her entire identity around ascending to exactly this kind of position. Declining, it meant watching her career plateau at 4 stars, missing the ultimate achievement. Accepting it meant potentially losing the ground she'd regained with her daughter. The old Elizabeth would have taken the job without hesitation, would have convinced herself she could manage both. The new Elizabeth, still forming, understood that some choices couldn't be managed, only made. She submitted her decision, respectfully declined Central Command, retain her current position for 2 more years, then retire. The Pentagon's senior leadership was stunned. General officers didn't turn down theater commands. The Secretary of Defense personally called her. "Elizabeth, this is career suicide. You're walking away from your legacy." She'd smiled, alone in her office. "With respect, sir, I'm walking toward a different legacy. One that actually matters to the person who needs me most." News of her decision rippled through military circles with disbelief, and among some of her colleagues, quiet admiration. A 2-star general she'd mentored years ago sought her out, asked to understand her thinking. Elizabeth explained about Morrison, about her daughter, about learning the difference between importance and meaning. The 2-star listened, then spoke quietly. "I've been missing my son's childhood, telling myself it's sacrifice for a greater good, but maybe I'm just scared of being present." Elizabeth's final 2 years of service unfolded with different purpose. She still served excellently, still made critical decisions affecting thousands of lives, but she no longer confused excellence with entirety. She advocated for programs supporting military families, spoke openly about work-life integration, became an unexpected voice for humanizing a culture that often confused strength with emotional stoicism. Some viewed her evolved approach as weakness. Others, particularly younger officers and senior enlisted, saw it as revolutionary permission to be whole people. Her daughter attended Elizabeth's retirement ceremony, standing in the front row with pride that would have seemed impossible 2 years before. When Elizabeth spoke to the assembled crowd, she told Morrison's story, with his permission, and explained how a maintenance worker had saved her life with 90 seconds of courage. She called Morrison up to the stage, promoted him on the spot from his civil service position to a special recognition typically reserved for military personnel, and awarded him the Meritorious Civilian Service Award. Morrison, uncomfortable with attention but moved, accepted with the same quiet dignity that had characterized their first meeting. In her closing remarks, Elizabeth spoke directly to her daughter. "The military taught me excellence, discipline, and purpose. But you, sweetheart, you taught me what all that excellence is actually for. You taught me that showing up fully for one person matters more than showing up partially for thousands. You taught me that being truly seen is scarier and braver than any combat mission. I missed so much of your life, and I'll regret that forever. But I'm here now, and I'll be here tomorrow. That's my final mission, and the only one that really counts." Later at the reception, Elizabeth stood with her daughter watching colleagues and friends circulate. Morrison approached, still visibly uncomfortable in his suit, carrying a small wrapped package. "Didn't know if this was appropriate, ma'am." "General, sir," Elizabeth laughed. "Elizabeth Gunny, I'm retired now." Morrison smiled and handed her the package. Inside was a small framed photo, clearly taken years ago. Morrison in marine dress blues with a young girl, maybe 10, laughing up at him with uncomplicated joy. "Took me 5 years after that photo to really understand what I was looking at," Morrison said quietly. "Wanted you to have it as a reminder. The mission is whoever's looking at you like they need you to see them." Elizabeth embraced him, this unlikely catalyst, this working man who changed a general's life by speaking simple truth. "You saved me, Gunny. I won't forget it." Morrison shook his head. "You saved yourself, ma'am. I just opened a door. You walked through it." They talked for a while, these two people from wildly different worlds who'd found common ground in the hardest mission, being genuinely present for the people who needed them most. Elizabeth's retirement unfolded into something she'd never imagined: actual time. Time to have coffee with her daughter without rushing. Time to rediscover reading for pleasure. Time to volunteer at a veterans center, offering mentorship stripped of rank and agenda. Time to realize how much of her life she'd spent preparing for the next thing instead of inhabiting the present thing. It was disorienting, occasionally boring, and more fulfilling than any command had ever been. Her daughter visited often, and they built the relationship Elizabeth had forfeited during decades of service. They traveled together to places Elizabeth had only seen through operational briefings. They cooked meals and had long conversations and occasionally fought about real things, which somehow felt more valuable than the careful distance they'd maintained for years. One evening, her daughter looked at her across the dinner table and said something that made Elizabeth's years of regret feel, if not erased, at least balanced. "I'm proud of you, Mom, not for the stars, for having the courage to choose me." Morrison and Elizabeth stayed in touch, occasional lunches where a retired general and a civil service maintenance worker talked about their kids, their struggles, their unexpected friendship. He'd been right about everything. The hardest mission was admitting what really mattered. Succeeding at that mission required more courage than anything Elizabeth had done in uniform. And the reward wasn't medals or recognition, wasn't legacy measured in operational successes or strategic victories. The reward was her daughter's smile, unguarded and genuine. The reward was knowing that when Elizabeth Kane was remembered, at least one person would remember her not as general but as mom. Present, imperfect, and finally, fully there.